Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to talk about the book Daughter of the Forest, and I'm actually going to break this into 3 different sections. The first portion I want to be for those of you who prefer not knowing a whole lot about your books before going in. I want to give you just kind of a very general idea of what you're going to be getting with this, and if that's enough to pique your interest, then I'll have it linked, you can check it out. But then for those of you that prefer to have a little bit more information before you decide whether to put something on your TBR or not, we'll get into a more formal review section. At the very end, this is a book where I do find that there's some very mature content that some of you might like having a heads up about, but unfortunately, in order to properly discuss those things, it does mean conveying some of the plot to all of you, and I know some people consider that to be spoilers, which is very understandable, which is why I'm saving that for the end. But jumping straight into it and getting into the part that is hopefully going to be just bare bones enough for those of you that prefer to know very little. If you like any of these 3 authors or a combination of them, already I would say give this a try. So the 3 authors would be Robin Ha, Mercedes Lackey, and Shauna Lawless. And I want to explain why I'm comparing those 3. I think when it comes to the way that the character is written and the way that the story is told to you, it is reminiscent, in my opinion, of some of Hobbes' works. When it comes to the comparison to Shauna Lawless, it's because of the Irish and Celtic components to the story. And also, it does kind of have a little bit of that historical fantasy feel, where it's not like you have this grand magic system. There is something to it that feels very real, very grounded, but also has this enchanting nature to it that I think is true of Children of Gods and Fighting Men. As far as the Mercedes Lackey comparisons, Arrows of the Queen, for example, that trilogy, that kind of kicks off the Valdemar universe. There are some moments in that are exceptionally wholesome and beautiful, and there are some very devastating cutting moments, and oftentimes you are coupling quieter, more intimate things with also some really big moments in a person's life that shape them. And I think the comparisons to Arrows of the Queen specifically kind of highlight some of what you will find within this story. Again, if any one of these authors is an author you like, then I would say there's a chance that you might like this. But I know different things work for different people. I have enjoyed Lackey, I have enjoyed Lawless, and I liked some of Hobbes' works, and then others didn't quite work for me, but even still, I think that the comparisons are apt. And I really liked Daughter of the Forest, so if you tend to have similar tastes to me, then maybe that's enough for you to have your interest piqued. Now, for those of you, though, that would like a little bit more substance as far as what you're going to get with this story. Of course, if you don't want to hear any of this, click off. This isn't the spoiler section just yet. This is just kind of giving you a little bit more details. I did not know when I went into this that it is literally a Grimm fairy tale retelling, specifically of the 6 Swans, which is a story about a young woman whose brothers are cursed and they are turned into swans. And in order to try and save them, she has to be silent and not make noise. And she also has to make these shirts that once placed upon them, then they will return back to their human forms. You've probably seen some other stories like this that are retellings of this. I think a prominent one that has come out in recent years would be 6 Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim, which is very, very fun. It's delightful. It sheds 100% its Grimm fairy tale roots, and it just sticks to the fairy tale and not the Grimm. This book sticks to the Grimm. It has some absolutely devastating, heartbreaking moments. Given that one of the themes of this Grimm fairy tale is resilience, loyalty, and sacrifice, you feel it in this story. First off, she can't speak for a large portion of her tale. And that in and of itself is heartbreaking because it really removes the ability that most of us don't even think twice about when it comes to how we connect with other people, how we express our emotions, how we express our needs, and just in general, how we are able to communicate at all. And so when you remove that, it starts to have a very intimate examination of the character and how she navigates life and how isolating it can feel when you have that taken away from you, but all in service of trying to save people that she loves. I think that was exceptionally highlighted in the story. But when I first started it, as noted, I had no idea. I had just heard good things about this author. I heard good things about the writing, and I thought, okay, finally, I found it at an indie bookstore. It was like $10. I had store credit, and I was like, oh, yay. And I decided to just give it a go. And I was immediately like, oh, I love this. I love the writing style. That's, again, the only thing I'd really heard about it was that the writing was great. So when I first started, though, you don't know that it's that fairy tale from the start. And also the way it's written, it does not necessarily have that classic I'm a fairy tale, I'm nonsensical feel. It very much grounds you in the setting. And Daughter of the Forest is the perfect title for this because it not only describes, I think, the setting really well, but the character also, where her roots are, what she loves, what she cares about. And this informs her motivations over the course of the story, and it informs her love of her home and her family. This is a little bit of an aside, but I just want to note that if you are somebody who enjoys audiobooks, I personally greatly enjoyed the audiobook for this, especially because there are a lot of names that I would have in my head been butchering. But I want to compliment how I think this author utilized first-person narration, which I know it is actually considered very annoying by a lot of people these days to have a story in first-person perspective. And I recognize everybody has their preferences. Some people just prefer third-person point of view. Some people prefer present tense versus past tense. There's always subjectivity surrounding those sorts of things. But I think the reason, if I were to try to tap into what a lot of people don't love about first-person narration these days, is that it is exceptionally casual. And it feels like I'm just chit-chatting with somebody I know, which is not necessarily objectively bad. It's just a preference, because for some people, they like that. It allows for them to feel like they can get lost, especially if we're talking about fantasy. They can get lost in this fantasy world alongside the character in a way where they feel attached to them, like they can experience it with them, with their friend is almost what it feels like. First-person narration, it can have a tone that can be a little bit more modern, but in this book's case, it did first-person better than I think most books I've ever picked up that utilize first-person perspective. And there are a couple of reasons why. One, the character, even though it is not written casually, it still felt like it was another additional way to ground us into this time and this place and to transport us, because she thought in ways that felt very realistic to whatever age she was at, because this does take place over the course of a number of years. So whatever age she was at, it felt like the story kind of matured with her and the writing sort of matured with her. But there is a little bit of like a storybook. It almost comes across like she's telling you this with hindsight. So it just kind of utilized all of that really beautifully. And then the literal word choice and the descriptions and the cadence was fantastic. There were a number of times where the narrator would kind of repeat certain things, or there'd be like a slight hesitation. And then when I would look at the physical copy, I would see that there would be an em dash used, or the word would be repeated intentionally to create a sense of voice for the character, but not in a way that feels too casual, or not in a way that feels like how we text with each other. It was gorgeous. And there is a passage I want to read later that I'm going to read just before the kind of more content warning section, because of course, just reading any passage might be seen as a little bit, not spoilery, but maybe is like more than some people want to know. But I want to read a passage that I think conveys a little bit of what I'm describing. It's not necessarily conveying the first person perspective. It's actually a moment of dialogue, but it gives you a hint of what I'm talking about with that kind of pause. And if you are going to click off before that point because you don't want to have anything for the book read off to you, I think maybe a comparison I can give is, I've never even watched Pride and Prejudice before, but there is that iconic scene, of course, where Mr. Darcy is expressing his love to Elizabeth. And when he does, there's that like pause when he's saying, I love you. It's like if you took that and like you very eloquently wrote that into the text. It had that. Not all the time. It wasn't overbearing. It wasn't overwhelming or overused. It was just very, very expertly placed. And it created certain moments where you felt like choked up because the character was choked up, or you felt fear because the character felt fear, or anger. And you felt all those things because of how much it attached you to this character. Also, given that for a large portion of the story, she cannot speak, it also allowed for you to be with her a little bit more, because of course, oftentimes dialogue is how we are accustomed to getting to see our characters, know our characters. And I think some authors will even utilize the practice of taking a monologue of their character, and they're never actually even going to use that monologue. They just like to write out monologues to get a sense of the character's voice. And in this, we don't have that. So it's almost as if we took that concept, but you applied it to the narration itself, and you applied it to just the text. And that is how we're able to convey her story. And her story is beautiful and it's tragic, but it was very, very moving. I really found myself being like, I need something good to happen for this character. And everything that she's putting into saving her brothers, I have to have something for her because it's too painful. You really feel for her and you really want her to persevere through all of this. And also the fact that I didn't even know I was reading a fairy tale retelling initially when I was starting it, I think speaks to how well that this author's authorial voice shines through, and also just how well she utilizes her story. Because there are some books you pick up and you're like, this quote unquote feels fairy tale. It's almost like you're borrowing from the what a lot of us think of when we think of fairy tale. And instead, this is like, I am writing a beautiful, lush, descriptive story that is grim, but also happens to have its roots in a fairy tale. And you're like, oh, I want more of this. I want a lot more of this. If you're curious, you absolutely can read this as a standalone. All that said, I want to read the passage that I thought was beautiful, but then I want to give some heads up about some of the very, very heavy topics that are within this book that some of you will want a heads up about. So this is just a quick snippet that is actually very, very romantic. When people talk about wanting yearning in their stories, I feel like this passage, it's going to give you an idea of whether or not the yearning in this is going to be for you. But this character, it's a love confession, and it says, "It matters not if you are here or there, for I see you before me every moment. I see you in the light on the water, in the swaying of the young trees in the spring wind. I see you in the shadows of the great oaks. I hear your voice in the cry of the owl at night. You are the blood in my veins and the beating of my heart. You are my first waking thought and my last before sleeping. You are bone of my bone and breath of my breath." I thought that was so, I mean, even if you're taking the romantic aspect of that aside, just how it's written is gorgeous. And there are a lot of callbacks to nature within how they speak because it plays such a monumental role in their lives. And so I love even within this confession of love, it kind of is tied back to the environment and also relates very well to who this character is speaking about. Also, I thought that passage was gorgeous. And that was just one passage of many over the course of the book that I could have pulled from. It's gorgeous. The writing is very beautiful. Content warnings, very, very, very serious, heavy stuff. First off, this one, man, did this one just break my heart. And that is that there is some animal abuse and death in this book. And just thinking about it is upsetting. And I know for some people, they just really cannot handle that in their stories. I wouldn't say anything in the book is written for shock value. It's not like they go on and on and on about these explicit things or these violent things. It's not like sensationalized. It's kind of like, and then when she found the animal, it was clearly dying or it was dead, that kind of thing. And you're just like, no. So there is some animal death. Another comparison to Hob, I might add. So that was pretty difficult to read about. Also, Serica is very young when the story starts. She's only about the age of 12, and by the time the story ends, she's between the ages of like 16 and 18. There is a love story in this. That's pretty young to have a love story. I wouldn't say the love story starts when she's 12. It does not. So I'm just to be clear, she's not 12 when the love story starts. But she's pretty young when she is first meeting the person that there is a romantic subplot with. And that person is older than her. They're not, 70 years old, but they're older. And by modern standards, we would be like, hey, no, we wouldn't really be okay with it. And so it feels notable because I know for some individuals, even though this setting, you understand why the ages are the way they are, because the time and place that this is inspired by, and also the fact that it's a fairy tale retelling, you understand why characters are written at this age experiencing the things they're experiencing. We aren't in modern day, but I know that this can be very uncomfortable for some people. They don't want to read about a character that when they're meeting their love interest who is a little bit older than them and they're like a teenager, I totally get why somebody would be like, I don't really want to. And then the last and biggest thing that I think is important for people to know, even though I thought how the author handled it was among the better of a lot of the books I've read that contain this, There is assault in the book. It is on page, similar to what I was saying about the animal abuse. It's not like it goes on and on and on and on, but it is appropriately horrifying. And her reaction is very realistic. Also, how she feels about it over the course of the rest of the story is also realistic. This is one of those things that is going to be so different from person to person, whether or not they like the way that her experience is shown. Because for some people, if you have experienced it, or even just the fear of it is something that is a part of your life, then maybe for some people, watching a character have such resilience through everything they've gone through, but also it's a struggle at the same time. It deeply impacts them. It affects how they think of other people, how they think of their future, what they want for themselves, even how they see their own body, how they want to hide or cover up, or they're afraid of those around them. All that, even if it's realistic and even if you can resonate with it, for some people, that is just too difficult to read about. For others, it can be cathartic because it can feel like you're being seen and that your story is actually being conveyed in a way that is realistic and can provide for people to, because it's so hard to have these conversations, especially if you've experienced it yourself or a loved one has. So sometimes it's very difficult to talk about it from your own personal experience. And in fiction, if there's like a means for someone else to, you could almost say, explain for you what it's like, which again, I do think the author took a lot of care to really, I feel like, very very thoughtfully showcase what it's like, not only in that moment but the after, if it's something that is actually where you appreciate that it exists, because we know so often it's just thrown in there. It is meant to just be shocking, and there isn't any reckoning, there isn't any actually wrestling with what would this be like, and sometimes it's focused on the person who committed the act rather than what that did to the person who was impacted by it. And in this story, I do think that she handled it very, very well. That does not change that for some people, they are not going to want to have to read this. There are so many other books that are wonderfully written and are great stories. And of course, do whatever you have to do. Take care of yourself. Read the works that are not going to, I know this word gets sometimes overused on the internet, but I don't want anybody to be re-triggered because of what they're reading in fiction. So, of course, you are your own person. You have an awareness of what does work and what doesn't for you. So I just wanted to provide that information so that you can do with it what you will. If that's something that you think, okay, well, as long as the author is thoughtfully examining this, then I think for me it could work. Then I will say I personally felt like it did. I personally can be very picky about how these things are handled. I have compared this story at the very beginning to Robin Hobb, and I will say I personally didn't care for how Robin Hobb handled these topics in some of her books. But I know for a lot of people, they do really think Robin Hobb did a good job. It just depends on person to person, but the point I'm trying to make is that I can be pretty picky, and maybe for you, that helps to know, okay, well, I was pretty unsure about how it was handled in Hobbs, so if it's handled maybe even more delicately, maybe it won't be as challenging. So I just wanted to give those heads up because I know they're very important. Unfortunately, these sorts of things are present in real life. That's why it's so difficult to read in fiction. And I wanted all of you to have the information so that you could make an informed decision about if this book is something you wanted to try. That's it, though, for this discussion about Daughter of the Forest. If you are interested in picking it up, I'll have it linked down below. If you've read it, or if you've read other things by this author and you'd like to talk about those, feel free to do so. If there's anything spoilery you wanted to mention, of course, as always, say spoilers and then enter so nobody has anything ruined for them. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.